Mascot horror is a subgenre that's kind of been taking the internet by storm these past few years, but why is that? How did scary, child-friendly themed creations become the next big thing? And what was it like before it was popular? Today, we'll be taking a deep dive into the history of mascot horror, the dawn of it, the midlife, and the current state of things. You may not be familiar with the concept of mascot horror, so let me bring you up to speed. Essentially, mascot horror is taking mascots, most often child-friendly appearing characters, typically anthropomorphized objects or animals, and turning them into the antagonist of the story. For some classic horror heads out there, think of the movie Chucky, a child-friendly doll turning into a quip-slinging, mass-murdering psychopath who kills indiscriminately. While Chucky is more of an evil doll than a mascot, I believe it provides a good view into how mascot horror operates. Or you can imagine Mr. X from Resident Evil as a giant Kermit snapping your neck like a Slim Jim with his giant frog hands. In short, childhood nostalgia, but with an evil twist. Now what I'm about to say may piss a lot of people off, but hear me out. .exe games are mascot horror. Before you kill me, hear me out. Cartoon character from your childhood, check. Somehow corrupted, check. Main antagonist of the game, check. It fits the criteria. If you're unsure what .exe games are, allow me to explain. .exe games are basically playable video game creepypastas. I'm certain you've heard the classic story of, I purchased a mysterious SNES cartridge from a garage sale because the owner's son died and he didn't need it anymore. His ghost still haunts the game, and I see his spirit in the game. Or maybe, I found an old copy of Mario in a GameStop dumpster, so I put it in my Wii. When I played it, Mario had bloodshot, hyper-realistic eyes and the game shut the system down. You know, generic early 2010s type horror stories. Now, take those stories and imagine actually playing the games that were described in those stories. In essence, that's what these games are. Let's discuss one of the most popular .exe games, Sonic.exe. Sonic.exe starts off with a twisted save file menu where you load in as the character Tails when pressed. Your Sonic instincts kick in, and you head right as you normally would. As you run along the path of the Green Hill Zone, you'll notice a lot of bloodied bodies on the ground, in trees, and hovering in the air before you're interrupted by a bloodied Sonic with a twisted smile. Sonic asks you to play a game, and you're transported to a dimension of fire and brimstone overlaid on what used to be the jungle area.
Hello. Do you want to play with me?
Soon, Sonic catches you no matter how far you run, causing Tails to scream out in terror before he's murdered.
I will eat your heart. You're too slow. Want to try again?
Next up is Knuckles, where I accidentally discovered a secret before actually properly playing his section. The game addresses you by the name set on your computer, just to really sell the fact that it's a haunted copy of Sonic. It continuously says you're next before audibly saying so. Then the level restarts itself so you can play it properly. Knuckles' level is much more of the same, except whenever you're caught, you can't go left or right, and eventually you share the same fate as Tails.
Found you. You will die at my hands. So many souls to play with, so little time. Would you agree?
The final level involves you playing as Eggman, or Dr. Robotnik for those Sonic aficionados out there. This level is rather boring compared to the other two, as you're just running downstairs until the game goes all staticky and a really funny picture of hyper-realistic Sonic with red eyes shows up before proclaiming that he is God, and then more loud static. Yeah? Oh, it's so loud! It asks you if you're ready for round 2, and after that, a wall of Japanese text is displayed, which I've translated to read, "There are ways to free yourself, a curse to retrieve our souls again, but we must speak it, but when we speak, there is no sound. We are all deaf, so failure is inevitable, and I regret ever entering my inner bet with the devil inside me. Immortality versus Soul Snatcher. Jake Shanley versus Gary Cook. Ambition is overrated." I'm not guaranteeing this is accurate, nor could I really find out who Jake Shanley or Gary Crook were in my research, and it seems like not many other people know either. Evidently, this is the worst ending you can get. As of writing this, I had no idea there were multiple endings. The fact this game has multiple endings is honestly very impressive for an indie game made in 2011. For the life of me though, I couldn't figure out how to get them, and I honestly didn't feel like listening to more loud static. Look, I'm serious, that static is horribly loud, and my head honestly hurt after playing the game. Maybe I'm cursed. In all honesty, the game wasn't that great, but I can see why it caused such an uproar and influx of copycats like Sally.exe, Mario.exe, and etc.exe. The midlife of this subcategory of horror is much more well known, but I still believe that it should be covered to fully understand the concept of mascot horror. Enter late 2014, a small indie game by the name of Five Nights at Freddy's was released. A simple yet refreshing title to the genre of horror that involved a lovable cast of terrifying animatronics to hide away from. The gameplay was very simple. Check the cameras for movement, close the door when the animatronics get a little frisky, and conserve power as much as possible, because if you don't... With several million total copies of the first game sold, it was certain that sequel after sequel would be released to capitalize on the flaming success the initial release brought. Along with this, extremely popular YouTubers covering the game such as Markiplier and Jacksepticeye, both with videos sitting at 110 million and 14 million views respectively, Five Nights at Freddy's practically became a household name overnight. Later, the sequels introduced some minigames and more complex mechanics like winding up a music box to temporarily keep one of the monsters at bay. It also introduced lore and history of the restaurant, which I personally won't be getting into. There's plenty of other videos out there that explain the lore of FNAF, and, well, that's not what this video is about. If you want to learn more about them, definitely check out one of the several hundred videos about FNAF lore. With that success, many people saw dollar signs and wanted to cash in on the mascot horror genre, or at least the jump scare genre. A majority of horror games post-FNAF use jump scares as their primary way of scaring their player base. I swear, you couldn't play a single horror game without a screamer flashing you and scaring the shit out of you. It almost seemed like 2003 again and the Scary Maze game made a comeback, but I digress. Cheap jump scares were in, and atmosphere and pacing were out. I'd like to believe that certain movies even follow this formula, because if you look at A Quiet Place, the movie doesn't really have too much substance, but it's loud as fuck at some points just to scare you. Granted, they do atmosphere very well, but I mean, most of the scares just come from loud shit. Like, I remember, like, in the theater, this is a genuine rant, I remember in the theater, or like at my home whenever I was watching it for the first time, there was a squirrel jump scare, just like for the sake of it, just funny haha. Squirrel jump scare. Boo! Because I never played FNAF before, I decided to actually give it a shot, and I'm honestly not disappointed. I knew how the game worked, I've seen every jump scare, heard all the ambient audio, the laughs, etc. Even still, I found myself genuinely scared and constantly checking the cameras on the first night. Every time a mascot moved from one location to another, my heart genuinely sank. Call me a pussy if you want, but the game does atmosphere and suspense very well, and I found myself actually afraid of these animatronics. The fact you're stuck in one location and your only way to tell if you're safe is with a shoddy camera and a messy map is definitely one way to inspire fear of these plushy nightmares. Hearing the dings and dongs of the morning bell and children cheering was genuinely relieving, albeit a bit of a jump scare itself because I wasn't really expecting it. Despite all this, the game definitely shows its age with a weird resolution, iffy graphics, and simplicity of all the mechanics. Along with this, the strange screen tearing the game had when you move the mouse was very noticeable and almost distracting, but I guess that just emphasizes the small team that worked on it. All in all, I recommend FNAF 1 to a ton of people if they like jump scares and, suspense, despite its few flaws. I feel like it's also important to talk about the side genre that FNAF created, the previously mentioned jump scare genre. Many games abandoned the feeling of dread and instead opted for loud screamers. Instead of a slow burn, it was instant satisfaction, like the cocaine of horror. I distinctly remember playing Gmod horror maps when I was like 12, and instead of there being a super intense, well thought out horror map with an in-depth story, there were poorly cropped, very grainy PNGs of spooky faces and the stalker scream blasting as loud as possible. It was like that old commercial where there's a car driving along a hill and a zombie face pops out and yells hysterically loud. I've seen so many jump scares when I was younger, I'm practically immune to them now. While games included jump scares, such as the father of jump scares Slenderman before FNAF was released, FNAF popularized the concept of it. As a matter of fact, the search result for jump scare has increased exponentially since the release of the first FNAF, and has remained a very popular search. Around late 2021, with the release of Security Breach, the concept of open-world/explorative mascot horror games became the new cash grab, with such titles as Poppy Playtime and its second part being released around the same time to capitalize on the popularity of brightly colored characters with menacing aspects. Garden of Banban is another piece of mascot horror which seems to be inspired by Poppy Playtime's simplistic character design, seeing as how the main character of the games are brightly colored, feature sharp teeth, and resemble children's toys. Along with this, it seemed to follow suit with the puzzle-solving aspect that Poppy Playtime featured through the use of a drone. The drone is used to press buttons, which would sound cool on paper if you couldn't already reach the button by jumping. It honestly feels like there's no point in having this drone other than for the sake of novelty and limiting the player. In any case, the gameplay begins with you finding a drone to press buttons that are barely out of reach. Then this leads you to a playground that features a bird character named Opila, who you must feed 6 eggs in order to get another keycard. This keycard allows you to make unbreakable yellow glass breakable for some reason, and when the button behind the glass is pressed, a door is unlocked and the player is greeted with a hammer to use back in the playground. Once the wooden planks are removed from the door, the player must cross an indoor cavern using a ski lift to solve a puzzle, essentially matching the outline of a character with a corresponding color. Challenging stuff, I know. Once completed, Opila can be seen riding the lift towards you. Next is using the drone to press a button and run across a moving platform, but because of how finicky the drone was, I died several times here. It seemed like I had to click the button several times while watching out for the bird. If the drone pressed the button the first time without stopping just before it, I'm sure I could have beaten the game without any deaths, since there isn't really another place for you to die. After you get to the other side, you press the emergency stop button to trip the bird into the pit, and you do some more backtracking to get to the next area. After using the keycard and the drone to hit the button, the floor opens and an industrial elevator arises from the hole. Once on it, it begins to descend, but it's interrupted by a giant green monster named Jumbo Josh. And then the game ends before telling you to purchase the sequels with actual human money. That's right, there's multiple parts to this game and they actually cost money, as opposed to the first entry, which is free. Personally, I'm not willing to purchase the sequels, or any of the merch for that matter. Oh, what's that? This game has merch? That's right. Immediately after the launch of this game, merchandise was made to capitalize on the game. And just by looking at it, it's not the highest of quality, similar to merchandise for Poppy Playtime. In conclusion for this game, however, I can't recommend it due to the stiff controls half-baked puzzles, and uninspired character design. From what I'm seeing, passion for these projects has gone out the window, and in its place lies marketability. As someone who works at GameStop, all I see in the front register is Poppy Playtime blind boxes, FNAF plushies, and action figures from similar games, so it's easy to see how the creators were in it for the money rather than producing something to scare and impact the player. Similarly, games that get released under the Mascot horror umbrella often have merchandise being sold day one. For example, Garden of Banban merchandise was being produced as soon as the game dropped, and as shown earlier, the game was made with minimal effort. Along with this, the consistent bad quality of these games really seems to diminish the overall reputation of the genre. From my experience, playing through these Mascot horror titles feels like going through a college student's first Unity project. It really brings me to question if Mascot horror was ever any good, or if it was solely made for marketability. Along with this, the attempts at making the game's lore deep really hurt the game rather than help. Many creators in this genre want to copy FNAF by diving into the lore route, such as the toys in Poppy Playtime being the workers of the abandoned factory's ghosts, or whatever Garden of Banban was trying to do. Mascot horror doesn't always need a complex explanation or lore. Overall, this has been a deep dive into the Mascot horror genre, and how minimal effort games focus on marketability and desire for deep lore tend to harm the games and the genre as a whole rather than help it.